We would like to thank you all very, very much for coming. Many people have come a very long way to be here today, and it's lovely that everyone's come to remember Paul. I think the day after what would have been his 91st birthday, would have been yesterday, is that right? Alan Shipton, who's normally on the radio at this time on Saturday afternoon, is not this, well, it must be recorded, Alan, I guess, and he's going to chair the formal part of the afternoon, but we just particularly want to thank the AA, and I just want to single out Alex Lorente and Guy, where's Guy? Somewhere he's outside, and Guy Norton, who've really welcomed us greatly and have very generously put on this event. So just let's say our appreciation to the AA for that. And without more ado, I'll hand over to Alan Shipton, who's going to introduce the programme. Thank you, Alan.
This is the moment when I say, please do switch all your mobile communications devices off. I'd like to just add to, you'll hear more from Ian in a minute, but I'd like to particularly thank, as well as the AA, those who've come a very long way to be with us today. And you'll be hearing from some of them shortly, including Dougie Melson from New Zealand. We have Rosie Latta, who's come all the way from Chicago, John Norton from France, and there are other guests here too from Ireland and Germany. And I'm sure there are more, but thank you all very much for coming such a way. And thanks too, in advance, to all the contributors who are going to make this an interesting afternoon, and to those who've given their material for the PowerPoint presentation that shows images of Paul that some of you may already have seen whizzing around on screens in the building. I'm just going to make two quick sort of, not quite health and safety announcements, but these memories of Paul are being filmed by the AA, and there will be some of this put up on the AA website. So please share this when it appears with anybody who you know who couldn't be here today and might want to be. And you'll have seen it on the way in, but the AA Bookshop have made available a book that's on sale today containing an essay by Paul on the Isfahan Bazaar, published in March 2018 after Paul's death. It's just called The Bazaar of Isfahan, and copies are available today. Before we get to the first of our speakers, Richard Hayward, who's a long-term colleague of Paul's, couldn't be here. He was planning to speak, but there's been a family issue that means he couldn't be here. And he said something that I thought was worth just starting the day with. As well as saying Paul was a much-missed colleague, collaborator, teacher and friend who always wore his knowledge, wisdom, reputation and subtle, engaging humour lightly, he says above that, it was Paul's ability to put ideas into words for exploration and discussion, extension, research, review, and more discussion. He felt that was Paul's métier. And things solid and often graphic, like rocks, full of inclusions from other worlds, full of possibilities. I think that sums up a lot of Paul. And so too does this very short poem, which Richard has sent by Gary Snyder. The poem's called Rip Rap, and the verse that he'd like me to read goes like this. Lay down these words before your mind like rocks, placed solid by hands, in choice of place, set before the body of the mind in space and time. Solidity of bark, leaf or wall, rip-rap of things, cobble of Milky Way, straying planets. So that's Richard's contribution. The first of our visitors, who I'm going to hand over to now, has come all the way from New Zealand. Dougie Melson and I have been in conversation by email. This is the first time we've actually met, and it's wonderful to have somebody who's actually part of Paul's extended family here. So I'm going to stand down and hand over to Dougie.
I'm so short I can hide behind here, guys. I'm Dougie, and Paul is our revered family member. How we are related is because the Edmonds family, there was my grandfather who was the second oldest, and then Paul's mother was the youngest in the family. So my mother and here we go. 2 glasses of wine, that's scary. So they were direct cousins, and we always knew about Paul, but my mother left England. She was born in England, and after the war, my grandfather had been gassed and shot in the war. So at that time, they sort of recommended that people leave cold, damp England. Sorry, guys, this is completely defiant. And so my grandmother decided that it had to be New Zealand because the New Zealand soldiers had been so utterly kind to her when my grandfather was lost and thought dead. So they came out in 1920. My mother was born in 1919. And my mum never met any of her cousins for a long, long time. She was an only child. So we were her family, and I have 2 special daughters here today. My son couldn't come, but we wanted them all here for Paul. Paul and Mum and I and the kids have done a lot of travelling back and forwards. So over the years, we got to know each other pretty well. And then in 2008, I was off to go to a flamenco festival in Sevilla, and I thought, right, well, I'll go to Paul first. We'll go to England, have a week, and we went to Parrots. Well, I went to Parrots, and then I just thought, Paul, you need a little bit of help here. This incredible person, but he had food that was neat. I'm a hygiene teacher, so I thought I need to do something about this. How am I going to do this and not upset? Because he kept everything of Val's, all her homemade wine, all her jams, everything of Val's he kept. Everything. I won't go into the details. So I said to him, after we'd walked Dartmoor and done these amazing things, I said, what's our come over and help you sometime? What can we do? How can I help you? I could do with some cataloguing. So that's... He didn't know I was going to sort the food business out. So he came back to us for Christmas in 2009. Incredible family time that we had with Paul. We travelled all the way to Tiki Tiki. Any one of you heard of Tiki Tiki? It's a little tiny place, predominantly Māori, where my daughter was living at the time, and he was there for my first granddaughter's christening. And we've got a photo of him. It's not on the PowerPoint, but there he is in the middle of this vast mix of people, looking like Merlin. You had the croc, and he... So I said, Paul, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, I think I want you to start cataloguing. Yes, but what? So I got over there about July, August in 2010, and I was going to be with him for 6 months, 6 months. Left the kids to sort themselves out. And I got there and I said, where do I start, Paul? You tell me where you want me to start. So we walked to the top of Parrots, and I'm in love with Parrots. It's been taken over and changed, and I don't think I want to drive past it. But we walked to the top of the house, and here was the table, laden with boxes, and John, and the whole table was like this, under the weight. And so I picked up a box, and I thought, right, well, I'll start from here. And that's what I did. I did page by page by page, page by page. He kept every envelope. He kept every advertising piece of paper. He kept everything, and he checked what I threw out. And I must admit, sorry, Paul, I would sneak out the house on a Sunday and take the rubbish over to the store so that he couldn't actually see it thrown out. So, yeah, there were lots of things. At times I got really cross with him, but I knew that my mother was there helping me, and I knew that Val was. So I'd say, guys, for goodness sake, help me here. And we got through, and we were absolutely in awe of each other. We were lucky enough as a family to know Paul as this blessed man who loved Val beyond, and he loved us beyond. I wanted him to come and live with us. And I tried to persuade him, but he couldn't leave parrots. He couldn't leave Val. So I'm going to read I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm just going to read Paul's words. And what I have here, when I left in 2014, I went back several times after that and carried on cleaning and tidying and got rid of all the old jams and wines. And I packed up everything in one of his suitcases and I took them home. So what you see on the screen, I'd scanned to Ian, but if any of you want to look at just a small sample of the real work that he did for his mother and his wife, these pictures are quite extraordinary. But it's what he writes in the middle, which I couldn't keep scanning everything. But they're funny. They're really, truly funny. But I want to read, and this is what I'm going to do today. I'm just going to read the letter without getting upset. Hey, girls. Yeah. This was to Val, and I came across treasures when I was going through these pages. I found treasures, the Richard Wright letters, which I actually photocopied because they were too special. I hope these aren't lost. So many things letters from the bluesman, letters back in 1960. I know I should be stopping. I am a teacher. So I've been teaching for 31 years and a dietitian 10 years before, so I'm used to talking, but I was scared silly about this story. Sorry, girls. You're allowed to sit down if you want.
It's hot. Yes, please.
Go and sit down. So this is a letter to Val, who was turning 21. Okay, because this is Sue and this is Val's cousin, like I was cousin to Paul.
So although we're not actually blood related, we kind of feel like long lost cousins, which is lovely.
And all the emails that I've had with people, not necessarily knowing their faces, but knowing you as friends and beautiful people, and anyway. I get all silly. Okay, so this is from Paul. My dearest Val, this is so very important an occasion I cannot find the right words to use. Perhaps the fewer the better. Today you stand on the threshold of your majority, the whole of your adult life before you, uncharted, unplanned and unexplored. Ere long, I too will be in the same position, and fate has willed it. I readily believe that we should share this wonderful life together. He's 20. Although we can only guess as to the nature of the future, it is my most fervent wish that you will fulfill your every ambition. I shall do all that is in my power to make this so, and I pray that I shall make you a worthy husband. Bon voyage then, my darling. Please accept these as a humble and very inadequate testimony of my devotion and good wishes. At such a time as this, it is customary to give you a key. You already have mine. Keep it well, for it is the key to my heart. May God always cherish and protect you with the very deepest love, from Paul.
Thank you, Doug, and I'm sure all of us who remember the collective noun Paul and Val absolutely treasure that. Thank you very much. Interesting what you say about the envelopes. I was once in the same room as Paul and Bill Russell, who is the great New Orleans historian, who kept a lot of letters from Jelly Roll Norton. But all of them were in their original envelopes, except that he'd snipped off the signature on the back. And I said, "Why did you do that, Bill?" And he said, "Oh, it paid for a violin." Anyway, Our next speaker is somebody I bumped into at a formal Radio 3 event at the House of Lords. He claims to have forgotten it, but we had a very entertaining conversation. And as so often happens, you meet somebody, you start talking about jazz and blues, and they say, well, of course, the person who really introduced me to this was somebody you've probably never heard of called Paul Oliver. So I wonder if I could invite Lord Young of Norwood Green, Tony Young, to come and say a few words about Paul.
Well, I certainly didn't expect to be at this occasion. Quite a hard act to follow, actually. I just want to sort of set the scene, because I started to think about Paul and his position. Harrow County Grammar School was a very traditional grammar school, very class-based. I can remember one of the first assemblies, Dr. Simpson, the headmaster, addressed us with the words, "You boys are the cream of the cream." He was well ahead of the other novel that we know. I thought, well, where did Paul fit in on this? You know, we had the school cadet force led by Major Bingham. We had the scout troop. We played rugby, not football. You know, we were a grammar school. And how I got in there, I do not know. I only managed to scrape through my 11 plus. So I started off as a D stream boy, and I maintained consistency in that level of academic achievement. But what when I got to thinking about Paul, I thought, well, he must have been the odd man out there amongst that group. But for all its tradition, it clearly gave him a certain amount of academic freedom. Now, I met him again, I think 2 or 3 years ago. I think the last occasion when the Old Gatonians, which was our old boys association, met, and Paul was there, and I made a contribution there. And he complained because I didn't talk about art. Well, I wasn't very good at art, and I don't think I was at the time particularly interested in it. He'd be pleased now, because I am avidly interested in art and architecture as well. So he would be. But the influence that Paul we really remember at this school, and you've got to remember, this is 1953-54. It's post-war. If I were to take you back to the hit parade in those days, it was a bit slow and ponderous. And then what was beginning to burst on the scene inevitably were American influences, although this one was skiffle, was our first, and Paul somehow got the agreement to create a skiffle group in the school. I'm no musician at all, so I wasn't any part of that. But not only skiffle, but jazz was introduced, and he sort of opened up our horizons into music. And I was reflecting on that. I can still remember, believe it or not, the first jazz concert that I went to was at the Royal Festival Hall. We could only afford the cheapest tickets, so we sat behind the band. But what a band it was. He would have been, I know, as a man who loved traditional jazz. We had Jack Teagarden on trombone. We had Barney Bigard on clarinet, Earl Hines on the piano, Cozy Cole on drums, and Roy Eldridge on trumpet. Yeah, that's not bad, is it, for a memory that's 60 plus years ago. And that little snippet that Alan told you about Jelly Roll Morton, well, of course, we hadn't heard of people like that until we started to research into jazz. And at that time, jazz was still in its heyday. Every town seemed to have a jazz club. I don't know those anybody of my era who can remember that, but I remember the Edgware Jazz Club. I remember so many jazz clubs. So Paul gave us a rich, I think, his legacy for me anyway was a rich love of jazz. And of course, I think it was about 10 or 15 years ago I found a second-hand copy of The Story of the Blues, which once again reminded me of what a man of many talents he was, almost a sort of polymath, if you like, if you look at the various things that Paul covered in his life. So from art to architecture and through to his whether it was his main love, I don't know, but certainly for somebody who wrote so extensively on blues and jazz, it was certainly high on his agenda. So I thank him for that. I'm glad I had the privilege of knowing him, because I think he stood out amongst the rather traditional teachers that we had at Harrow County County Grammar. And although it never gave me a great education, as I was dragged out of school at 15, it was, I think, an interesting school. And anybody who had Paul Oliver as the art teacher and with a license to roam into jazz and skiffle, that's pretty good in my book. Thanks for listening.
Well, we're not going to leave the jazz and blues area just yet. I'm very glad that amongst the people here today is somebody that I've had a long association with. We used to do broadcasts together on BBC Radio 2 a long time ago. And then for several years, Tony Russell and I were involved in producing a series of those cover-mounted CDs that go on magazines, which you could buy in a well-known chain of, you can't actually say who they are, of course, if you're a BBC employee, a well-known chain of booksellers, and then people could sign up to get them through the post. So I'm very delighted that we have Tony Russell here, and I'm just going to ask our friend at the back if we could have a couple of microphones so we can have a bit of a two-way chat. So, Tony. So, Tony, let's just start by looking at this remarkable collection of books that I found on my shelf.
Being a bit opaque there, I think we better actually show the audience the remarkable collection you were talking about rather than hide behind the lectern. These are examples of a series of books called the Blues Paperbacks that Paul was the overall editor of starting in 1970. He'd had a big success with what a lot of people thought of as his what became his most popular book, and a lot of people thought of as his major achievement up to that time, which was The Story of the Blues, just referred to, which was published in 1969 by Barry and Jenkins. I only mention that because it wasn't actually put together by Barry and Jenkins, but by a small independent production company called November Books, who got on so well with Paul that between them they came up with the idea of probably somebody from November said to Paul, well, your blues book's doing well, can we get some more? And Paul said, well, I haven't got anything at the moment, but I have some friends who do. And promptly initiated a series, which in the end ran to 12 books. His own Savannah Syncopators was one of the first. There was a quartet that came out in April 1970, I think. This was a groundbreaking at the time, and probably for a long time, account of the Africanism of the blues, a vexed question which is still being hotly debated, but Paul laid down a marker early on with that book. There was also a book on the history of the blues recording business, a book on Ma Rainey and the classic blues singers, the women blues singers who preceded the more collectible male singers by some years, and were effectively the blues recording business for half of the 1920s, and a small book by me called Blacks, Whites and Blues, which attempted to sort out the relationship between blues and parallel traditions of white country music, old-time country music, a theme which I've devoted the rest of my life to continuing research into. And anyway, these went down quite well. They were published here, they were published in the States, and given that they were all written by English people, got quite a respectful reception from American reviewers. And another 8 followed, not all by English authors, and now opening it from books written chiefly from a desk 4,000 miles away from the blues to, we now had books written from reporters from the front line, as you might say, field researchers who were actually Americans and who actually regularly journeyed through Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia or wherever, and wrote books about what was currently going on, rather than, as in the first books, what had been going on 50 years earlier. And so it expanded into quite a successful in the sense that it enabled a lot of people who had ideas about the blues to get into print. And for this, I shall always be always be grateful to Paul because he enabled me and most of the other authors in this series who had never written books of any size before to get our ideas out, which had Paul not had this idea and promoted it to publishers, we'd probably all have been sitting at our desks unpublished ever since. So that's just the first of many, many debts that I owe to Paul.
So there's a
long answer, I'm sorry.
No, great answer. And there's another area, I think, that certainly some people in this room will remember, the much lamented magazine Jazz Monthly, which late Albert McCarthy used to edit, a man who...
yes, that was when I first came into contact with Paul, really. I mean, I'd met him, I think in about 1964 or 5 when I was at Oxford, and he came down, as he periodically did, to give lectures on one or other blues topic, and of course I went along, and soon after that I think I had the temerity to review his then latest book, not with the not with all the respect that I might have shown him, and Paul with remarkable forbearance, didn't mind these whippersnappers coming up and saying, well, Paul, I think you made a slight error there and you could have done that slightly differently. And all his life he was very indulgent about. I now look back with horror upon the way in which we traduced him by getting helped by him and then nibbling at, if not actually biting the hand that had helped us up. And then Paul had been for many years the regular blues reviewer for Jazz Monthly magazine. If you wanted to write about blues in the 50s or early 60s, you had to do it in a jazz magazine because there were no blues magazines. And jazz magazine editors regarded blues a little patronizingly as sort of within the general remit of what their magazines should be covering. Interesting, antique, and a little off to one side, but permissible. And so blues writers snuck in, and when Paul found himself deluged by records of modern blues that he didn't care for too much, I was brought in to supplement him by a sort of second string reviewer, and that was where we first appeared in the same pages together, probably about in the later part of the 60s.
And the other thing, which I think you and I have talked a little about, which is another of Paul's great gifts, is that he would spot somebody who he thought might be, on the one hand, just the right person to do something he didn't either have the time or space to do, but also it would be giving them a helping hand in their career. And I gather that he did something very similar. He
did, yes. There was, at various times people approached him to do something with his enormous archive of material. And one of the first to do that was a friend of his then working at the University of Sussex, who suggested that they set up a Paul Oliver archive for his papers and recordings and all that. And this being a university, somebody had to commission a feasibility study to see just what was involved in taking on this, rather unknown quantity of, tables, groaning tables full of boxes of who knew what. And Paul generously suggested that I might do this, which really meant roaming around amongst his collection, making notes of things, and preparing a sort of, if you take on this archive, it will involve this and this and this. For which I got paid at a time when I could very well have used the money, and that was the kind of generous thing that Paul would do. He would realize that he was too busy to do something himself, and instead of just turning it down, he would think of somebody that he thought might be able to do it, that he knew who could use the work, and trickle it in that direction. And that was another thing that was I remember very fondly of him, that he had remarkably little ego for somebody who was so distinguished in his line of work. I don't know if this is also true of his architectural standing, but certainly in blues, he was, for many people, the preeminent scholar of his generation, and there was never the slightest swagger in his step, so to speak, though he would have been entitled to display it.
Tony, thank you very much. So that's a brilliant note on which to end, and I think all of us who knew him in that blues world would concur with that.
Thank you.
What you do with 2,000 quid's worth of microphones when you don't know where to put them, just put them on the floor, that's the answer. we're now moving to the architectural side of Paul's life and work, with somebody who has a connection with this place, the Architectural Association, and the influence of that. I'd like to invite John Norton to come. Just before I do, John's somebody who's based in a place that very nearly had quite a significant place in Paul's own life, because about 15 years ago I made the decision to go and try and live in France and move down to southwest France, and Paul said quite unexpectedly, oh, we were going to do that, and Val and I found somewhere, we were going to move down there and we were going to set up a development workshop, but my allergies were so severe that actually in the final stages of house hunting we realised that I'd never be able to go outdoors, so the project was stillborn. But fortunately John did do that and works in the most delightful place between Cahors and Valence d'Argent called Lozerte, and I'm sure he can tell you more about that and his work in development and Paul's contribution to vernacular and development studies. So John.
First of all, thank you for asking me to say a few words. Paul actually came into my life and my colleagues' lives right here in this room at the AA in 1973. And it was the year that my colleagues Alan Kane and Farrokh Afshar and I founded the organisation we still run called Development Workshop. And you will see some of the interest that Paul had in what he first did for us. He assessed my joint AA thesis for my diploma, and that was on the potential of indigenous building in a developing country. And we chose, at the time, Oman, which was a very unknown country and very untouched by the outside world. And we studied every building type and planning type and material and lifestyle that was possible to study in great detail, going out and walking around in the sea in the middle of the night to test the temperature. We traveled to places that celebrated people like Wilfred Thesiger never got to. And we wrote something equivalent to a large telephone directory. And Paul was most appreciative. He said the study could hardly be improved upon in its thoroughness, which was nice. But he then added the warning, first of all saying, but who is it aimed at? And it's a good question. I don't think we'd really thought a great deal about it, apart from getting my thesis through. And he then pointed out that it really has to be comprehensible to the intended user, and we hadn't identified one intended user. I suppose we had in mind that the Sultan of Oman might be him. And he, and I'll paraphrase, he feared that, like a lot of other similar worthy studies on the use of the vernacular and on indigenous building, that our Oman report might not influence the future built environment in Oman. And I have to admit that I've never been back to Oman. I've had opportunities and I thought, I'm not going to risk that. But I think he was probably right. It didn't have any influence, despite other people picking up chapters of our work and publishing it in glossy books, which was very nice of them. However, he did us a big service, because we took his message to heart at a time when we'd had opportunities to go and do research about shelter in developing countries and indigenous building in particular. And Paul's words actually acted as a stimulus and as a guide to us over the years. And we actually had the opportunity immediately after this thesis story to go and work in Iran, applying things to the people we knew were the intended users and making sure it was comprehensible. And we worked with Luri nomads who were being forcibly settled by the Shah, and they had no experience of living in one fixed place because they were always used to moving on when life became intolerable, usually because of too much rubbish outside your tent. And it shaped my world completely. I've carried on working on the same theme all my life, and our work has been largely built on respecting and learning from local knowledge and local priorities as a basis for addressing emerging shelter needs worldwide and identifying what we do and how one can develop local capacity to address needs that meet local realities. And that is an ongoing nature of what Development Workshop does. And back in 1998, when we created the France version of Development Workshop, so it had started in 1973, but we spread it out into different countries, Paul became an honorary member of DW, which he was gracious enough to accept. But in fact, the honor really was ours because he gave us continued guidance. He and Val came out to stay with us. I didn't know about the, I suppose, hay fever concern in those days. Anyhow, he came out with Val to us in France, first of all, to explain about the Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World, and a project that then was just being launched and which I'm still working on the second edition 20 years later, and even rewriting some of his entries, which is quite a privilege. And then he came back later on, another visit on a birthday, which Rosie let on to us because he wasn't going to tell us it was his birthday. And he then devoted his time, his stay with us, and I had my colleagues with me, to consider how Development Workshop could record and pass on its legacy, which was a rather remarkable position to be in, to think that he thought what we had done was worth recording and sharing. And I can say that it will be beginning to be publicly available on the internet as of this year, although I've just finished the 70s at the moment, so it's a bit of a long process. So he's been helpful, just like other people have said. He was generous in his thinking and his time, and he's remained, even though he's not with us, a strong influence, but above all, a really delightful and insightful friend. And I miss him, and it was a great privilege. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you, John. Absolutely, that point about the way in which Paul combined friendship with insightfulness and encouragement. I suspect there are many of us in the room who've been privileged to have that range of advice. And I'm glad that many, many years ago in a restaurant in Oxford, Paul and I sat down and discussed what we thought was wrong with the Macmillan Dictionary of Art. And Paul said, well, the big problem of it is it's all about formal art. It's got nothing about vernacular traditions. And they've asked me to write 3,000 words on vernacular architecture. And I think it should be at least 300,000. And I said, well, why don't you think in larger terms and make it a proper encyclopedia? And we ruined a tablecloth with a felt tip pen, actually starting to plan out that book. And a bit of a hoo-ha about taking it away with us. But nobody had iPhones in those days. You couldn't photograph what you'd just written. And that was the beginning. And just so you know, I mean, Paul was terribly dogged about some ideas. I had a lot of experience in reference book publishing, and I said to Paul, you know, this book ought to be alphabetical. And he said, no, it can't be. It's got to be about the 3 different areas of the discipline, and each has got to have its own separate section of each volume. And to the end, that's how it's organised, which means that if you don't know anything about the subject, you can't find anything. But if you do, it's fantastic. Rather like the boxes in the attic. Anyway, we're now going to pick up Paul's story. So we followed him from Harrow County Boys' School into writing about blues and to the Architecture Association. And now I'm going to ask Chris Cross if he'd like to take us a little further on Paul's career trajectory.
This is a mixed bag of stories and a few threads. I apologize if I'm not so easy to hear. Can you hear that? I mean, I'm all right. Okay. Well, just a beginning to be reminded that when Paul first came to the AA, he came to be the drawing master, and the AA had a tradition which I knew 2 years before he came, where there was Bernard Myers, who in the first year would teach all sorts of Bauhaus kind of skills and careful things to learn to do to stretch your graphic and other abilities. And Paul, having got through the door, as it were, then obviously expanded his ideas, became interested in other areas, and his interested in vernacular buildings was very well supported by various characters who were in the air around at the time. There was Otto Königsberger, who acted as was an acting AA head in the mid-60s, and John Lloyd, who came in 1966, was very sympathetic to many of the things that Paul was interested in. And Paul in 1964 worked, I think, for quite a while in Kumasi in Ghana through that connection. Did I get that right? Pat knows everything. He's brilliant. He did a very good obituary in the AA files. Anyway, as Paul developed here, he became more interested in specialist programs, graduate programs, and there was obviously some kind of clash at the AA between that interest and the world of Indigenous buildings and other things that developed in the school. And one consequence from this was that the development planning unit at University College London was set up, which was essentially the material and the ideas that had developed here at the AA going to University College London, where it has flourished very, very strongly. And in 1973, Paul left the AA and became head of art and design at Darlington. And I know Chris Crickmay is going to be talking a bit about that, but just one connection to that was when teaching in the first year at the AA in the late 70s, mid-late 77, something like that, we had the idea that the first program you might do as a student would be to design. In week one, you design, build, make, prefabricate a structure in which you could spend a night and safely. And Paul was approached about could we organise something with Darlington. Paul did a most brilliant talk about Darlington, the way it worked and what inspired it, and obviously it's inspired him to want to go and be involved with it. And he organised a field at Darlington where the student structures could be tested. When we got there, the field was slightly sloping, and it was a bit wet and rather muddy. And these structures, which were made of bamboo and sheeting of various sorts, they were so adventurous, so interesting, but quite a number collapsed during the night. And next morning was about the going to the laundrette with putting people undressing into the drying machines. Anyway, now Paul, in 1978, after 5 years at Darlington, went to Oxford and became the associate head of architecture, and he set up shelter and settlements as a study area there, I think. or you did. But anyway, shelter and settlements flourished there. And Paul was very supportive of that. And Bob Maguire, as the head, was very supportive, I think. Now, when Oxford was looking for a new head in 1985, Paul approached me. He came to our house in London with Val, and he persuaded me to apply to try and run the school at Oxford. And it was a very good, very encouraging discussion, and he was very, very supportive when I did in the end go to Oxford. Just one final thought. The last event at the AA I could remember to do with Paul was when he was 80, and there was a party organised on the floor above here in the library, and there were drinks and ... And people expected it to be casual and relaxed and cheers. Paul gave a very serious lecture about the blues and work he had in hand and further work he was planning. It was really inspiring. Thank you.
Well, as Chris mentioned, we have another Chris Crickmay who will talk us through a little of Paul's time in that area of the country that was always very dear to his heart, the Southwest.
By my arithmetic, Paul was 46 when he went to Darlington in 1973. And as Chris Cross already mentioned, he was actually only there for 5 years. And I followed him in his job, which is, I think, why I was probably asked to say something about him and his time at Darlington. And obviously that was a tricky act to follow. He was, as Paul was such a brilliant man. In thinking about this, I asked myself, why was Paul interested in Darlington, and why was Darlington interested in him? And when the two came together, what happened? So very briefly, I thought that's how I would organize what I had to say. But before I do that, I want to do something which I think Paul would approve of, which is to just think about 1973 and the years leading up to it, and actually what the context was of his work at that time. So very briefly, because if Paul was lecturing on this, he would probably take most of the day. This was the era. I think that probably people old enough to remember of a thing called the Whole Earth Catalogue. Anyone remember the Whole Earth? I found an old copy of it on a top shelf. The back cover fell off and I brought it down. I blew the dust off. And I thought to myself, well, the Whole Earth Catalogue was a bit like a sort of low-tech version of Paul's brain. But unlike my copy, which had all this dust on, Paul's brain obviously didn't have much dust on it. He was his brain was always very sharp. It had one of the very first pictures of the Earth from space on I think, maybe all the editions. And it says, "We can't put it together, it is together." That's the slogan on that. I don't think we would necessarily agree with that now. Maybe it's maybe it's not together anymore. As you know, this May is the 50th anniversary of the student uprisings in Paris, May 68. And it was only 5 years after that that Paul arrived in Darlington. And I think the flavour of that was still there. And there was a kind of echo of May 68 at Hornsey College of Art in London, which one or two people may know of, where there was a sort of big student sit-in and a protest about art education. And a number of people contributed to this book of essays called After Hornsey, which, funny enough, came out in 1973, this year that Paul went to Darlington. And I thought, because one of the essays is by Paul, I just thought I'd read a line from it. He says, where are the courses which direct our potential design talent towards the major problems of our times? And then a few lines later, he says, the environmental crisis is also a crisis in design education. And so that was the sort of spirit, the kind of thinking that Paul took to Darlington. And I think it's interesting that very same year, 1973, Britain joined the common market. It's probably quite a good idea. And the oil crisis occurred. The country suddenly got thrown into financial difficulties. Under the Heath government, he instituted a 3-day working week. And that same year, E.F. Schumacher published his book, Small is Beautiful, which I'm sure a lot of people here would know of, which was a critique of Western economics, which was very much taken up at Darlington, and in fact in 1990 they set up a Schumacher College, which is still going. So that was the sort of, those were the things that were around at that time. So then, very briefly, I'd like to say sort of why was Paul attracted to Darlington? Darlington College of Arts, where he went to in his new post, was a small rural arts college with 3 arts. It had music, theatre and visual art. So Paul was going to be head of the visual art department. And of course he was rather interested in the idea that it was a cross arts thing because of his interests in different, particularly in music as well as visual art. There were only about 300 students, but in the sort of Schumacher principle, small is beautiful, and it was in fact, apart from anything else, a very beautiful place. So actually, almost everybody wanted to go there, as well as Paul. Comparisons have been made with Black Mountain College, but maybe they're a little bit overblown, because Darlington didn't really have the famous teachers or students that Black Mountain had. Paul's attraction was, I think, to the wider Darlington, which was a rather interesting, by then, a rather interesting trust that did work in the arts, in education, and in rural industries, and was particularly interested in sustainable environmental ideas, and also in small-scale initiatives, community initiatives, which obviously had tremendous overlaps with Paul's interests in Indigenous housing and so forth. So then, the reason that Darlington was interested in Paul hardly need spelling out, really. He was clearly a very brilliant scholar. He was internationally known. He was very well connected. And the I think Darlington saw him as maybe breathing a bit of life into what had become a rather quiet backwater. A small course in visual art, which was to do with art education. There's this terrible term that exists now called special measures, that applied to hospitals and schools that aren't performing well. And it was a bit like that, I think, although perhaps not so extreme, that Paul was brought in to rethink this setup. So he was parachuted in. He'd been headhunted for the job. And clearly, there wasn't going to be a very smooth start because the staff there, obviously, quite understandably perhaps, were a little bit resentful of having someone brought in over their heads to sort them out. But I think fairly quickly, Paul managed to turn them around, and he had a particular vision for Darlington, which was a kind of Bauhaus-like vision of bringing art, design, and craft together with ecological ideas. So that's essentially what he did, and then applying to that all these ideas about community and a closer connection, I would say, between art and people's lives. I think that's what his interest was. And in fact, that a course called Art and Design in Social Contexts, rather lengthy title, did come out. It was not until 4 years later, I think. So that's what happened. That's the account. And I just wanted to end by mentioning my favourite project that I heard about, because obviously following Paul, I heard all sorts of stories. And the project was in an area that Paul lectured on, which was to do with semiotics and perception. And what he set his students to do during the holidays was to send something to him in the post. It had to be something kind of interesting. But the main purpose of the project was to see how minimal an address could be in order to come through. So I don't know how many students there were, maybe 30 or something. They all sent him something. One student sent him a full glass of beer, somehow, through the post. But every single one arrived, including ones where only the minimal tops of the letters were in the address. It was absolutely wonderful what the post office could achieve. So I think Paul was well remembered. He, as other people have said, he was very supportive. He maybe didn't achieve everything he would have liked to for financial reasons, but I think he did well, and he left behind a course which I picked up which became Art and Social Contexts, which ran for about 25 years. So, job done.
I'd now like to introduce our penultimate speaker, and somebody who's had an awful lot to do with organising today. So a special vote of thanks to him when he gets here for so many aspects of putting today together. But a colleague of Paul's at Oxford Brookes, I'd like to introduce Ian Davis.
Thank you. It's very interesting hearing about Darlington. I remember once putting on a series of lectures on utopias. And Paul talked about Darlington and the Elmhursts and as being his great heroes. And it brings me right back to one of those lovely talks that Paul gave. Most of what I really feel about Paul is in the PowerPoint, which you might see while we're having some music later and some drinks. And we hope that there'll be a PDF made of that, which can be put on the website of the AA. But it's a great pleasure to report on two people who've written to me, who've asked me to say something about Paul briefly. Amos Rappaport, who was one of Paul's leading colleagues in vernacular architecture. I suppose the two of them took the subject by the scruff of the neck and gave it a tremendous airing. And he tells me that he's far too old to travel, and he doesn't know how to use a computer, and he can't do emails, but he nevertheless heard about Paul from a obituary in the New York Times, and he wants to send his greetings to the meeting today and say what joy he had when they stayed in each other's houses and had so many common interests, and he's very sad at Paul's passing. And the other message is from John F.C. Turner, who's the same age as Paul. He lives down in Hastings. He's not been well. He says Pat Crook and Stephen McFarlane were also the same age. So he writes, "I'm so sorry to miss this chance of meeting friends to remember Paul. How much we have to share from his creative life. I've been acutely reminded of how much I learned from him, particularly from his books Shelter and his book on dwellings, houses across the world. Now they're even more relevant. Shelter calling for a clearer focus on the fundamental nature and values of primitive dwelling." I don't think Paul would have liked that primitive word, but never mind. Values of primitive dwelling and vernacular architecture illustrated so well by the 10 Friends essays with which Paul so effectively introduced the deep study of vernacular building. Followed up with his astonishingly rich worldwide source on ecological dwelling and community building ways. He said this set a curriculum for in-depth study in all aspects of form and function. And this is a typical bit of John Turner. Now we're confronted with the burnt-out grave of dwellers that have paid the ultimate price of false values and perverse practices, the exact opposite of those that Paul celebrated in music and architecture. I look forward to hearing ideas and plans for a further promotion of Paul's rich legacy. I first encountered Paul in 1967 when I applied for a job in a crummy architect's office in Mayfair, and name best not reported. And I turned up for the office and was told the job I'd been recruited for no longer existed, and therefore I wasn't needed. And I said, "So are you firing me?" He says, "No, we're not firing you. You better go to the other office, which is the other side of Grosvenor Square, and they might have something for you." So I went to the other office, and they said, "We don't want any dirty washing bringing in here, thank you very much." It's a very rather rude thing to say, but I didn't fancy myself as dirty washing. But anyway, they didn't want me either. So I was kind of stuck between two offices. I hadn't been sacked, and then I found the American Embassy halfway between the two, with an exhibition called The Story of the Blues, which was rather appropriate because that's exactly the mood I was in. Wonderful photographs by Paul and Val, it turned out, and music being played. And that was my introduction to the blues and my introduction to Paul. Later on, I started research on shelter after disaster with Otto Königsberger at Development Planning Unit, and was quickly introduced to Paul's books. And they were an absolute revelation. I mean, I can't believe how wonderful they were. Just to read Shelter in Society and Shelter Sign and Symbols, Shelter in Africa. Paul was a wordsmith. He just produced books like Hens Lay Eggs. I mean, it was extraordinary, the books he produced, and keeping the quality all the time. So I knew a lot about Paul. And then fast forward to 1978, and Bob Maguire had created a new associate head of department, and somebody persuaded me to apply. Two of us applied from the department, and there were two externals. And we were sitting in this room waiting to be interviewed. And I said to my colleague, Alan, I said, "Do you know who the externals are who've been in place?" He says, "No, but one's called Oliver." I said, "Oliver who?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "It's not Paul Oliver, is it?" He said, "It might be." So somebody came with a cup of tea and we asked who it was. They said, "It's somebody called Paul Oliver and he's come from Darlington." well, I said, I don't want to be interviewed for this job because I want to work with this guy and he's bound to get it. And sure enough, Paul got it. And what a joy it was to work with him. Amazing. It just went on and on, all the joys of doing things with Paul. Field work in Turkey, Serbia, Pinner. We went to Pinner on expedition, looking at suburban housing, much to the amusement and disdain of our colleagues and lots of students, and Chiswell on the south coast. Did you come, Jack, on one of those trips? What, sorry? You came to Pinner, where we looked at the architecture of Trowbridge. Do you remember that? Yeah. Going to conferences with Paul in New Mexico, Ankara and Paris. Wonderful uproarious laughter from Paul in Paris because we were giving this lecture in the Pompidou Center, and one of the lecturers overspilt his time, and suddenly the lights went out, and the projectionist, it was 6 o'clock, it was time for him to leave, French working to rule, and locked the door with the slides inside, and Paul thought this was very, very funny. The lecturer didn't find it at all funny to think of all his slides being locked up inside the projection booth while this man was working to rule. We did lots of joint teaching and a lot of joint writing, which was great to work on. And we formed a unit together, Disasters and Settlements Unit, and that's still going on. It's called CENDEP now, Centre for Development and Emergency Practice. And Paul's legacy just continues on, both in vernacular studies and in development work. Well, I ought to just finish by just giving a few really good memories of him. One was Paul sitting cross-legged in a little house in Ankara in Gediz in Turkey, while there was two-way conversations going on with translation. And while the translation was happening, Paul was furiously drawing. And on the PowerPoint, which you might see if you have time or you're having a drink, those drawings are reproduced. He gave them to me as a present. And they're little drawings of people inside those rooms. And he just a typical example of Paul, always wanting to sketch, and he drew beautifully. And I remember him doing that. And he always said, you must draw, you must keep drawing in, you must always keep drawing. And we did. And then I remember writing with him, and he was great at writing with, because in his lovely handwriting, your script would come back with corrections, all very polite. And I'm sure at Harrow County, Bob, he was very good at English. He was always correcting grammar and sorting it all out. And he had these dreadful puns. He was very great at puns. I saw one yesterday in the paper about, it was about double negatives being a definite no. And I thought Paul would have loved that. He had a great love of sometimes painful ones, but they'd come on these bits of writing, and I treasured the experience of writing with him. More seriously, I remember after Val's death, walking around Blenheim Park with him. We used to have these long lunches, and he would talk and talk and talk. And I've never met anybody who was so devoted to his wife. I suppose they didn't have children, and this just was a wonderful kind of bond. They were, as Alan said, they were joined at the hip. I mean, it was a unit. And so after Val's death, it was really hard for Paul, but gradually he came to terms with that. And my last memory is of being with him probably about 2 months before his death, when he couldn't really half recognize me, but it was just the sort of look of peace and joy on his face. He was surrounded by his music, which Marcel and Michael had kindly provided for him, and his books, and a lovely photograph of Val and himself taken by Philip Ofer. Wonderful. Just to finish with, I think when you're an academic, and there are many academics in the room, when we're supervising PhD students, the first conversation you have with them is often, your proposal is rather too broad. How about some boundaries? How about cutting it down in size? And let's see, it's only you doing it, remember. This isn't a team of people. So let's be realistic. Let's cut it down. Let's look at one aspect. Well, thank the good Lord that Paul never did that. Paul took the story of the blues, and he took vernacular architecture, and he just grabbed it. And he grabbed it on a global scale. I've never met anybody like that. I think he's the most impressive man I've ever met. And maybe he had this great self-confidence in himself. I remember Alistair Cook said about Abe Lincoln, Abe Lincoln was an only child. He says, and only children really do believe in themselves because they've been slightly doted on. And I think Paul had that. He was never spoilt, but he had huge self-confidence, but it never ever became arrogance. And he seemed to just positively relish in getting other people to do things. And no sooner had Paul started on a project than there'd be X, Y, and Z all working with him and sharing in it and growing and taking on new initiatives. That was what was so wonderful about him. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a huge privilege to introduce our last speaker, who's come not quite as far around the world as our first, but a pretty good stab at being the furthest flung. Rosie and I corresponded a huge amount during the genesis of the Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture, mainly because, in a very modest sort of way, Blackwell Publishers were paying very few of the bills. One of the things I'd like to say, and Rosie may say more about this, but Paul was absolutely a genius at fundraising. When we'd had that conversation in the restaurant and brought the paper part of the tablecloth back and turned it into a plan for the book, I said, well, Paul, you do realise that this is going to cost millions? And he said, yeah, but I think we can find quite a lot of that. And he managed to get a huge grant from the Getty Foundation on the basis of matched funding. And the matched funding was a collaboration between the publishers and Brooks to provide an office somewhere for the book to be assembled. Val, of course, was the invisible funding in that she, quite a long time before Dougie, started cataloguing and catalogued lots of the stuff that went into the book. Also indexed according to known principles of indexing, which was quite a problem for those of us who had to pick it up later on at the publisher's end. But he then went and got more money for travelling from another foundation, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, donated generously to make sure that the areas of architecture in the Middle East and of the Muslim world were also properly represented in the book. Paul was just absolutely fantastic and holding out the begging bowl and not only filling it, but it would begin to overflow. And that's what enabled those huge books, because the other one that he played a more than walk-on part in is the multi-volume Encyclopedia of Popular Music of the World, which Bloomsbury is still publishing in many volumes. It's now up to, I think, 7 or 8 of the planned volumes. And Paul was very much the driving force between the colleagues in Canada and in the UK at Liverpool and Exeter who started that project off. Wouldn't have happened without Paul's, again, inability, as Ian said, to cut things down to the minimal. So, without more ado, let's introduce Rosie.
Well, I'm going to talk about the X, Y, and Z that Ian mentioned in the last presentation. So, I'm going to talk about him as a teacher, my teacher. So this will be somewhat personal, but I hope it'll resonate with you. And I want to talk about some of the ripples that has made in the world. So you only really need 1 or 2 great teachers when you're in college. And I was very lucky to have found mine early. At age 18, I joined the Shelter and Settlements Unit, run by Paul and Ian Davis and Stuart Lewis. And I had found my people. At the end of term, Paul asked me to write a critique of the class and read it at the final seminar. And I duly produced a glowing summary description. And he said to me, well, that was all very nice, Rosie, but it wasn't what I asked for. It was a direct and incisive comment delivered with his kindness that showed me that I was allowed to, or even expected to, have my own opinion, and that it mattered that I did. It was quite the lesson, and I didn't know then how to evaluate or make judgments about much. But Paul had given me a roadmap, and Russell will attest that I'm pretty good at that now. So 15 years later, I found my way back to Brooks, working for Paul on the Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World. He introduced me to the publishing world, and I learnt the content and skills, but more importantly, I absorbed his approach, his strategic design vision of what the volumes were to become, together with his detailed attention to graphics and writing that elevated it to the seminal work and the early version of actually crowdsourcing that it was to become. And I'm happy to know that it resides in many libraries around the world, even my favourite in the hometown of Chicago. Sitting alongside Paul and Val in their office, I observed their long and close relationship. It was a much-needed model for me personally. And one day when we were going over the glossary of architectural terminology, we got to the letter N, and he stopped at the word necking. He smiled and looked over at Val, winked and said, "That sounds like fun." She replied, "Oh, Paul," in her common, exasperated but very affectionate rebuke that I was to hear many times. So I completely fell in love with them. They were so proud on the day the volumes arrived from Cambridge, and they held it up like examining a newborn baby. There's a picture of that in the PowerPoint, actually. So on the completion of the encyclopedia, with the support of Chris Cross and later Richard Hayward, Paul established the master's course in International Studies in Vernacular Architecture. And over the 8 years that it ran, we met over 100 students from every continent who spent a year with us, and then who went back into the world in all manner of architectural, human-centered practice. There are students who work, one, for example, for the World Health Organization in Kenya, who work teaching in India, in Thailand, in China, who work in conservation affairs in the USA and in New Zealand. And I this morning got a message from one student in New Zealand who I would like to read, thanks to the marvels of wonders of Facebook. If you'll bear with me a minute, I think it exemplifies the effect of Paul's teaching in the world for the next generation. Hello from New Zealand, and I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to make a video, but I wanted to send a message and share with others today. This is Ellen speaking, Ellen Anderson in Wellington, New Zealand. I attended Oxford Brookes to undertake a Master's in Vernacular Architecture Studies in 2003, and it was a wonderful experience. It changed my life and helped shape me as the person I am today. I would like to describe to you what I have done for a job in New Zealand for the past decade. My job title is Maori Built Heritage Advisor for Heritage New Zealand, a similar organisation to English Heritage combined with the National Trust. Along with 2 other colleagues, we provide technical and practical advice to Maori communities who want to conserve or restore their buildings. Often these are the iconic hoirai or the carved meeting houses, but at times it might also be an uncarved house, a small wooden church, a schoolhouse, or a place where they store their heritage artefacts. We work with communities to develop conservation plans. We run workshops teaching groups how to care for their buildings and building fabric, and sometimes we advocate for the survival of buildings that are threatened with demolition. I love my job. I'm so glad that I have this opportunity to contribute to my culture in such a positive way. And I often think that Paul could not have imagined a more perfect job to exist for someone coming out of the programme. It was Paul who graciously responded to an email from me in 2002 and suggested I apply for the programme, so I really do have him to thank for the career I have today that has also taken me to Hawaii, the Solomon Islands, Australia, Japan and Samoa, all for the research and sharing of ideas around Indigenous architecture. I guess I should also thank Paul for my happy marriage to Pete, who I met while living in Oxford, and our 3 beautiful daughters. So I will raise a glass to Paul Oliver this evening, feeling grateful for the wonderful impact he had on my life. So that is also, there are many alumni of the International Studies programme in vernacular architecture who are in architectural practice in England, in London and Oxford, and some of you are here, which is great. And I think most people remember our field trips and their special moments with Paul. I used to bring my young sons on the field trips with Russell taking care of them, and I asked them their memories of Paul. The youngest one was 7 at the time, and he remembers picking blackberries with Paul. He said to me, Paul was kind and he didn't talk down to me. The older one, who was 12 when he left for America, said Paul was wise and gentle, and he had the gift of unlocking others' curiosity and learning alongside you. And that is what I am most grateful for. The great privilege of learning alongside Paul for a decade or more, listening to him crashing away on his typewriter as if writing were playing, sitting beside him at his light table as he crafted his slides into another virtuoso lecture. Walking and looking carefully at a drawing or a building, or stomping across the moors, guiding a gaggle of students trailing behind. After all, what more can a person want than to leave behind a trail of love and admiration, to have spread your positive influence throughout the world, the legacy of my great teacher. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Rosie, and thank you to everybody who's spoken today. I know there are several aspects of Paul's career we haven't even touched on. One thing we had hoped to do is to talk a little more about Paul's career as a broadcaster, and I'm delighted that his erstwhile producer, Derek Dresch, is here, who worked with Paul on a number of series about the blues. We both had experiences of working with Paul as a broadcaster, and with that same enthusiasm and desire not to be limited, Paul was somebody who could make any broadcast about his chosen subject interesting, and he'd always managed to bring in little bits of information that you might not have thought about. So you'd suddenly wonder why there weren't any recordings made at a particular time. And Paul would say, well, of course, that's due to the shortage of coal. Didn't you know about that? And marvellous person to be along with a microphone talking to others, because he would always inspire them to think about what they knew and then draw more out of them than any of us would think possible. On which note, thank you all for coming. I think it's time to go upstairs, drink a glass in Paul's memory, and some of us are going to try and make a little music, at least in the spirit of some of the things that Paul loved and experienced over the years. Thank you all very much.